Okay, so I might not have had this typed when you downloaded the handout, but this should say lecture 4, and then this one was of the title of the meditation was of God, that He exists. So just want to make sure that you have that there. Um, Sorry, not lecture 4, but was it lecture 3 actually? Yeah, so we started this as lecture 3 of God, that He exists. We spent quite a bit of time on that last video, so I decided to make another one. So I'm going to call this part right here lecture 4, and you should put a note that we are still in meditation 3, and we are going to also wrap up meditation 6. So we're still in the meditation 3 right now, and it says of God and that He exists. All right, so this is going to pick up where the last lecture left off. So Descartes goes on in meditation 3, wondering whether there might be other items or other content in his mind, other beliefs in his mind, other ideas in his mind to which he might be able to apply this rule. If he can apply the rule of clarity and distinctly to an idea or some object in his mind that is an idea, and it is clearly and distinctly perceived, then that idea is one that he can be absolutely certain about and hence can count as an item of knowledge. So now he's wondering, what else can I apply this? Is there anything else in my mind that I can apply this to? So he says, I previously accepted as perfectly certain and evident many things that I after realized were doubtful. The earth, sky, stars, and everything else that I took in with what? The senses. But in those cases, what I perceived clearly were merely the ideas of thoughts or those things that came into my mind. And I am still not denying that those ideas occur within me. But I used also to believe that my ideas came from things outside them that resembled them in all respects. Indeed, I believed this for so long that I would wrongly come to think that I perceived it clearly. In fact, it was false. Or anyway, if it was true, it was not thanks to the strength of my perceptions. But what about when I was considering, okay, so he's wondering whether or not the rule of clarity and distinctness applies to his ideas that he gets about an external world or ideas that he gets from the senses. He's not so sure, and so he moves on to consider another kind or class or category of ideas that he has. So he says, but what about when I was considering something simple and straightforward in arithmetic or geometry, for example, that 2 plus 3 makes 5? Didn't I see these things? Here we go. So right, every time he says clearly and or distinctly, he's applying that rule that he thinks he came up with a priori in the previous paragraph. Did I see these things clearly enough to accept them as true? Indeed, the only reason I could find for doubting them was this. Perhaps some God could have made me so as to be deceived even in those matters that seemed most obvious. Whenever I bring to my mind my old... Okay, so now what he's wondering is about a second class of knowledge. He's wondering about ideas that would be associated with reason, not ideas or beliefs that would be associated with the senses or experience, but with reason. So he says, whenever I bring to... And so he's wondering, can I reclaim those ideas? Like 2 plus 2 equals 4, 2 plus 3 equals 5. It's impossible for something to be 100% physically in one room and 100% not physically in one room. He's wondering whether those kinds of ideas that don't rely on the senses or experience, in terms of sensory experiences, that don't require confirming that there's an external world or corporeal world of any kind, he's wondering if ideas like 2 plus 3 equals 5 and basic metaphysical logical principles do meet the criterion of his rule, that is, that they can be clearly and distinctly perceived. If this is so, then he can rescue all of logic and mathematics from the fires of skepticism. So he says, whenever I bring to my mind my old belief in the supreme power of God, I have to admit that God, if he wanted to, because he's all powerful, a lot of you have the idea that God is omnipotent, if he wanted to, could easily make me go wrong even about things I think I see perfectly clearly. But when I turn my thought onto the things themselves, the ones I think I perceive clearly, I find them so convincing that I spontaneously claim, let him do his best to deceive me, he will never bring it about that I am nothing while I think that I am something. Or make it true, And again, this is a translation issue. Even with punctuation, we would use a comma, probably. Well, I guess a colon would be okay. No, in fact, we wouldn't use anything. So it's actually one statement. And that's another thing with translations, especially older translations, is that punctuation and mechanics might be different. So I tend to clean those up for modern standards as I go through here. So, or make it true that in the future that I have never existed, given that I do now exist. Or bring it about, again, I'm going to update the punctuation. This is old punctuation style based on an earlier translation. That 2 plus 3 make 5 or less than 5. Or bring it about that 2 plus 3 make more or less than 5. Or anything like this in which I see a plain contradiction. Okay, so right here what he's talking about are ideas or beliefs that he thinks he is discerning clearly and distinctly with his mind. He's thinking through these ideas in virtue of the words and the concepts named in virtue of the words and how they connect to each other. And he thinks he's using a priori thinking to come up with a priori ideas, a priori derived ideas and implications, consequences, whatnot. Also, since I have no evidence that there is a deceiving God and don't even know for sure that there is a God at all, the reason for doubt based purely on this supposition of a deceiving God is very slight and theoretical one. A very slight and theoretical one. Okay. Now he goes on to say, however, I shall want to remove even the slight reason for doubt. So when I get the opportunity, I shall examine whether there is a God, and if there is, whether he can be a deceiver. If I don't settle this, it seems that I can never be quite certain about anything else. Okay, so here what is going on? All of a sudden, you are seeing him focus on the idea. He's linking the idea of clarity, and so he really means his idea, his rule for clarity and distinctness to decide if a given item in his mind, a belief or an idea corresponds with reality and can be counted as true and can be counted as justified and as knowledge. He's bringing in the idea of God. So he decides that, as you can see here, is that he needs to examine whether there is a God, okay, and whether he can be a deceiver. If he's a deceiver, of course, he would not be omnibenevolent, and that's what a lot of people think that about God. They think that he's all good. But if he can deceive us in our thoughts about, in our ideas that seem clearly and distinctly true, that we think we're clearly and distinctly perceiving, if God is all good, he shouldn't do that, right? So we need to rule out the possibility that God is a deceiver, because otherwise this rule of clarity and distinctness doesn't even make any sense. It can't be used. So in other words, what Descartes wants to do epistemologically speaking is he wants to validate the rule of clarity and distinctness that he came up with in the other paragraph. And he thinks to validate that rule that helps us to see whether an item or a belief or an idea counts as knowledge, he wants to show that what? One, the word God refers to something real. Why? And he has to show that God would not deceive him in applying this rule. And he wants to do this so that God, again, can validate the rule of clarity and distinctness. So he's going to have to do some metaphysical reasoning, some metaphysical thinking in order to advance his epistemological project. He needs a metaphysical argument to support his epistemological rule for deciding when he is certain about something and hence can count that something as an item of knowledge. So interestingly enough, again, I invite you to think about this. Is there for you a necessary connection between knowledge and God? Do you think that genuine knowledge, that we can have justified true belief, that we can be certain about some beliefs even if the word God does not refer to anything real? Or do you think that the word God must refer to something real in order for us to be absolutely certain that our beliefs are true and correspond with reality? Okay, so now let's go ahead. So he does this, and then he gives an argument for the existence of God. He goes on to a metaphysical argument for the existence of God, and then he goes on to argue that God is not a deceiver. Because he does this, he thinks that he has rescued all of our reason-based, a priori justified beliefs from the fires of skepticism and knowledge. In other words, he has rescued reason, ideas and beliefs based on reason from the fires of skepticism. But that only gets him to mathematical and logical truths. So he's rescued the disciplines of geometry, math, logic, calculus, trigonometry. But remember, his original goal is to save what? Science from the fires of skepticism. So he's only halfway through his project at this point, and that's very important to keep in mind. One thing I want to show you is, well, in a way, all of this is a look into what might be meant by a priori thinking, what it might look like for trying to find an argument here real quick, what it might look like for a philosopher to engage in, who's a rationalist, to engage in a priori thinking. So that's one goal. And right now, I'm going to bring up, you got an argument, a metaphysical argument. You got a version of this argument in the Lawhead book, but what I do not like about Lawhead's treatment with respect to Descartes' first argument for the existence of God in Meditation 3 is that he doesn't tease out important assumptions in the thinking or implied premises. So what I want to do is we're going to read through this. I want you to understand that this is a metaphysical argument, but keep in mind that Descartes thinks he has to prove the existence of God, make a metaphysical claim in order to advance his epistemological project, that is, so that God can validate the rule of clarity and distinctness. All right, so I'm going to make a few lecture points in doing so. And what I want you to be thinking as we go through here is Descartes is not appealing to the Bible. He's not appealing to his preacher. He's not appealing to religion. He is not appealing to spirituality or anything like that. I want you to see how he, as a rationalist, as someone who believes reason is the ultimate primary source of all knowledge, the conduit to certain knowledge. I want you to see him as a rationalist using a priori thinking as he proceeds through this complex argument, through this complex chain of reasoning. And again, this is one interpretation of what's going on in some of his argument for the existence for God at Meditation 3. There's actually so much more. Meditation 3 is like 10 or 15 pages long, and he has to raise all kinds of other arguments and objections to the arguments before he even gets here. So again, this is an intro class, and while this might seem like a lot, believe it or not, I'm leaving a lot out. And as you can see, since I am leaving a lot of his reasoning out, even we still have a complex argument, and you can see that the arguments in philosophy are much more complex. Okay, so let's go ahead and look through this and try to get a sense of what it looks like to be a rationalist, to think about reason as the primary source and route to knowledge, and to engage in a priori thinking. So premise 1, I have an idea of an infinite substance. A lot of you think that God is infinite and that, God refers to something real and that a property or characteristic of God is that he's infinite. Premise 2, I am finite. So this is on behalf of Descartes, okay? I am finite. Premise 3 implied in the thinking. What is infinite is more perfect than what is finite. Premise 4, what is more perfect cannot come from something less perfect. Subconclusion, my idea of an infinite substance cannot come from me or be caused by me. He actually has an argument for some a priori justified metaphysical principles entailed in this part of his reasoning. But again, this is an intro class, and we're supposed to be focusing on epistemology, but as we see with Descartes, we have to get bogged down in metaphysics a little bit to understand his epistemology and to understand how he works through his project in the Meditations. Another subconclusion, the mere fact that I have an idea of an infinite substance is not sufficient for explaining the fact that I have an idea of an infinite substance. Okay, so think about that. Even if you do not believe that the word God refers to something real, you still have an idea of God in your mind. Your idea of God might be that he's all good, all powerful, and all knowing. Your idea of God might be that he's all powerful, but that he's not all knowing and that he's not all good. Whether or not you think the word God refers to anything real is a separate issue from whether or not you have an idea of God. And that's exactly what Descartes starts off with in his reasoning. He's not presupposing the thing he's trying to prove. He's not saying, well, the Bible says there's a God. Why would that be circular reasoning for the argument that God exists? Because if you appeal to the Bible and I ask you, how do you know the Bible says only true things? You're going to say it was written by God. But then you're presupposing God's existence to use the Bible to argue that God exists. You cannot assume in the premises what you're trying to prove in your conclusion. That is a circular argument, so it would be invalid via the standpoint of logic and philosophy. So he doesn't do that. He also doesn't start with the external world, because remember, he hasn't rescued ideas from experience and the senses from fires of skepticism. So he can't do any kind of argument from design. He can't appeal to a physical nature, a world of the natural world, and say, look, doesn't the world seem to have a beautiful design, a beautiful order, everything connects? Beautiful design, this is an intelligent design. An intelligent design implies an intelligent designer, therefore God exists. He can't do that. He has not reclaimed the senses as a source or route to knowledge of any kind in any way. So what he's doing is he's not presupposing that God exists in his argument for God. Therefore, he's not appealing to religion, tradition, the Bible, scripture. He's starting with the contents of his own mind. And in the context of his own mind, he has this idea of God. And what we're seeing is what he is attributing to the ideas of God and the inferences he's making based on the ideas he associates with God to some ideas about what could have produced that idea within him. Okay, so continuing on. It is a fact that I have an idea of God in me. The idea that I have of God is that he's an infinite, independent, supremely intelligent, and supremely powerful being that created me along with everything else that exists. Again, he is not saying there is a God here. He's not saying that I am certain that there is a God. He is not saying in premise 4 that I am certain that he created everything. He's talking about an idea he has in his mind. He's inspecting a content item in his mind. For example, again, to make this clear, I could say, tell me about your idea of a unicorn. Does the fact that you have an idea right now in your mind of a unicorn mean that there actually exists in physical reality, organically and naturally, a being that actually aligns with your idea of a unicorn, that is not constructed, composed, or created by human beings in an artificial way? No. But I could still ask you to tell me about the qualities or the properties that belong to your idea of a unicorn without anyone confirming that there is actually a referent or a physical existing unicorn. That's exactly what Descartes is doing here. He's just inspecting an idea as an idea. And here he's inspecting his idea of God, but he is not yet claiming that this internal, subjective, mental, cognitive mind object has anything that exists independently of him in reality that goes along with it. Premise 5. It is not possible that the idea of an infinite God could have been caused by myself alone. Subconclusion. This idea of an infinite God must have been caused by a being that actually has this greater perfection. Subconclusion. That being that caused my idea of God as infinite is God. Final conclusion. God exists. This is actually a really interesting argument if you think about it, because it might be more compelling if you're trying to convince people that God exists. Then a lot of people who do not believe that the word God does not have a referent will not believe any arguments based on the Bible or religion, because you're going to have to already presuppose God's existence to validate the religion or the Bible. But this goes purely based on reason. This is a purely rational, a priori argument for the existence of God. And so there's a lot of important terms here. So what are the key concepts in here? Idea, that is the most important idea in this metaphysical argument, that I have an idea of something. And then we've got infinite and substance. Finite, infinite, perfect, finite, perfect, less perfect. And here you could say more perfect. Idea, infinite, substance, causation, infinite, so idea, infinite substance, not sufficient, idea, infinite substance, idea, God, infinite. And then a lot of these characteristics: independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, being, exist, idea, infinite God, caused, idea, infinite God, caused, being, greater perfection, being, caused, idea, God, God, God. Do you see how he is using these ideas in an a priori way, right? The words that we just highlighted as fundamental and powerful concepts in his reasoning. Do you see how he's using them throughout these statements and thinking in an a priori way about how they connect to each other to get to his conclusion without any appeal to the natural world, to the Bible, to religion, to the Quran, to any holy text of any kind? He's just doing this in an a priori way. So there's a few takeaways that I want you to get from this. One is I wanted you to see how a rationalist might try to argue for the existence of God in an a priori way. I wanted you to see what some of the words and phrases are that he uses in an a priori way to get to his a priori derived metaphysical conclusion. And of course, at the beginning, as I said, I wanted you to understand that while this is a metaphysical argument, he feels it's so important that he engages in it so that he can validate the rule of clarity and distinctness. So he does go on to argue that God is not a deceiver. And so by the end of Meditation 3, he believes that he has validated the rule of clarity and distinctness. And because he thinks that ideas or beliefs derived and justified ultimately by reason meet the rule of clarity and distinctness, he believes he has rescued an entire class of knowledge or beliefs or ideas from skepticism, that is those based on reason, so the disciplines of math and logic. So logic, arithmetic, algebra, calculus, trigonometry, and whatnot. All right, so now we're going to get to the last part of our lecture. This is we're almost done with this part, and then after this we'll have one more lecture, but let's get to the last part of this lecture. It's pretty short. Going back to our handout. Okay, so we're going to skip over Meditation 4 for right now, but I definitely want to come back to it. It's going to be our last lecture. We'll be on Meditation 4. And it's going to follow up really nicely with Meditation 3, but right now we're not going to be concerned about it. Meditation 5, he gives some other arguments for the existence of God, again, to make sure that he's convinced as many people as possible that God exists, to validate his rule of clarity and distinctness. And right now what we're doing is we're going to take a look at the last meditation, and we're going to look just at this passage alone. So we're not looking at as much text as we have prior. So give me a second right here. I need to reduce this window. All right. To reduce it a little bit more, sorry. Cool. So for this one, we're still in lecture 4, I believe, but we're going to skip to meditation 6. So up here, you can put meditation 6. We have skipped meditations 4 and 5. And the title is Of the Existence of Material Things and of the Real Distinction Between the Soul and the Body of Man. I want you to note the first part of the title. He says, of the existence of material things. So think back to my lecture on dualism and materialism. Both the materialist and the dualist, those are metaphysical positions, believe that the cosmos includes material substance, physical matter, physical energy, right? And so it isn't till meditation 6 that Descartes gets back to the external world. He says, and so he's doing some argumentation, he's reasoning, he's thinking through things that he's thought through before in the meditations. And what he's now trying to achieve in meditation 6 is he's wanting to apply that rule of clarity and distinctness to the ideas he has of external objects, of corporeal objects. He is trying to figure out, can my ideas or beliefs that there is an external world, a physical body, material objects, including a body that goes with me as a thinking immaterial mind or soul that has reason, a physical biological body, do these kinds of ideas about those kinds of things rise to the standard of clarity and distinctness? So Descartes says here, For since he has given me a very great inclination to believe that they are conveyed to me by corporeal objects, I didn't see how he could be defended from the accusations of deceit if these ideas were produced by causes other than external objects. It's just a link to a lecture that I posted there for some reason, I think, or some supplemental material. Hence, we must allow that corporeal objects exist, and really, that was supposed to be right there. Okay, so this is from Meditation 6, and I already gave you the title. And as you can see, there is an argument in here. So let's go ahead and work through it. So obviously, you would bracket and number the statements, and I think I'm going to help you out more with this last argument than I have with the other ones. So we've got, for since he has given me a great inclination to believe that they are conveyed to me by corporeal objects. So that is a statement right there, and you can see that there is an indicator. So what does since typically tell you is coming? Then there's another statement that begins, I do not see how he could be defended from the accusations of deceit if these ideas were produced by causes other than external objects. So that's a conditional. Instead of saying if x then y, the conditional is just reversed. It's y if x. You still do not chop it in half. So he's saying, I'm giving you a reason in support. I'm giving you a reason in statement 1 in support of something in statement 2. So what would statement 2 then be? All right. And given the proper label for statement 2, what would you have to conclude that statement 3 is in particular? So again, this is where you're applying knowledge of simple and complex arguments. All right, so think about also, in this argument, he is basically now connecting what? The idea of God, not the idea of God, but the existence of God, who has validated the rule of clarity and distinctness, to the belief or idea we have that corporeal, that is physical objects, exist independently of our minds. So I am going to have you clarify this argument as well. So make sure you mark it up according to the hints that I have given you. When you do he, you need to tell me who he's referring to. So even though I don't have the word God, keep it in context of mind of the meditations, we want to replace the word he with God when we see the word he. This is going to make the nature of his argument much more explicit. Whenever you see corporeal objects, so you're going to make sure you're applying uniform language. So if you use corporeal objects in the first statement, make sure you use corporeal objects throughout. Notice that corporeal objects, it's much more precise than corporeal things, right? Or if you want to use external objects, or if you want to make it even more precise, even better, say external corporeal objects. That would be the uniform language to use throughout the statements. Okay, so some ending lecture points. So now, at this point of the meditations, he believes he has rescued ideas that seem to come from the senses and experience, from the fires of skepticism. He believes that he has rescued an entire class of knowledge then. So now we can have knowledge that is espoused to us from disciplines, the discipline of science. So biology, astronomy, physics, chemistry. He has rescued an entire class of knowledge. So he has finally, he thinks, with this, rescued science from the fires of skepticism. But in doing that, en route to that, he thinks he has rescued, generally, knowledge from the fires of skepticism.